The girl said it at breakfast. Not screamed, not sobbed. Said, quietly, clearly, with her hands folded beside her plate and her blue eyes fixed on the woman across the table. "You will never be my mother." The kitchen maid froze by the sideboard. A spoon hovered above the sugar bowl. Outside, a January wind pressed against the windows of Fenwick Hall like something trying to get in. Harriet set down her teacup. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She had learned, in years of mornings like this, that flinching only confirmed whatever story the girl had been told about her. "I know," Harriet said. "I am not trying to be." Charlotte held the stare for 3 more seconds. Then she pushed back her chair, left her toast untouched, and walked out of the dining room. Her footsteps echoed down the stone corridor. A door closed. Then nothing. Harriet sat alone. She lifted her teacup and drank. The tea had gone cold while Charlotte was speaking, but she drank it anyway because putting the cup down would mean her hands were empty, and empty hands had a way of shaking when no one was watching. The kitchen maid, Polly, 15, wide-eyed, holding a sugar spoon like a weapon, stood absolutely still. "Polly." "Ma'am?" "You may serve the toast." Polly served the toast. Harriet buttered a piece she did not eat, and the morning continued at Fenwick Hall, as mornings did, as if nothing had happened, because in this house what happened to Harriet never counted as something happening. That line, "You will never be my mother," is not from a novel. It is something real stepmothers hear, at kitchen tables, in hallways, in quiet rooms where no one else is listening, and the woman who hears it almost never answers. She sets down her cup, and she stays. Welcome to Duke of Hearts Romance. Tonight's story is about a woman the world decided was a villain before she ever walked through the door. A physician's daughter who married a widower raised his child through. Illness saved his estate from ruin and was repaid with silence. Suspicion, a slow, careful erasure that was so polite, so gentle, so wrapped in concern and good manners that no one ever called it what it was: cruelty. And it is about what happens when a duke arrives expecting to find a scheming stepmother and instead finds a woman keeping the books by candlelight in a room they moved her to because they ran out of ways to make her smaller. Let me take you there. Harriet Marchetti was born in Cambridge in the spring of 1818 in a narrow house above an apothecary's shop that smelled permanently of dried lavender and tincture of willow bark. Her father, Vincenzo Marchetti, was Italian by birth and English by stubbornness. He had trained as a physician in Padua, crossed the Channel at 23 with a trunk full of botanical texts and precisely no social connections, and spent the next 30 years building a medical practice that the gentry of Cambridgeshire considered excellent but inconvenient, because Dr. Marchetti had the troublesome habit of treating servants and tenant farmers with the same attention he gave their employers. This was not, in 1820s England, a path to wealth. It was a path to respect from the wrong people and suspicion from the right ones. The local physicians, Cambridge men licensed by the Royal College, regarded Marchetti with professional courtesy that concealed professional fury. Harriet's mother, Anne, was English. Practical. The kind of warm that women married to obsessive men develop out of necessity, filling the spaces their husbands forget exist. She kept the practice's accounts, managed the household, and raised a daughter who could identify foxglove toxicity by age 9 and calculate compound interest by 12. Anne died when Harriet was 19. Consumption. The disease that did not care whether your husband was a physician or a butcher. Marchetti continued his practice. Harriet continued everything else. She kept the books. She maintained the herb garden behind the shop, which had grown from a practical collection of medicinal plants into something approaching a research laboratory. Test plots of soil amendments, copper sulfate preparations for plant disease, careful records of germination rates, and growing conditions kept in journals that filled an entire shelf. She read Justus von Liebig's Agricultural Chemistry in the year it was published and corrected 2 of his assumptions about nitrogen fixation in her margin notes. She did not write to Liebig. She was a physician's daughter with no credentials, no university, no institutional affiliation. Who would read a letter from Harriet Marchetti? At 25, she was an unmarried woman with no dowry, no beauty by society's measure, and a mind that made drawing rooms go quiet, not with admiration, but with the particular discomfort that descends when a woman says something intelligent and no one knows how to respond without acknowledging that she has said something intelligent. She attended 3 seasons of assemblies in Cambridge. She danced twice, both times with the same elderly widower who danced with every woman in the room as a matter of policy. She stood at the edges of conversations about weather and fabric and eligible sons and felt invisible, not overlooked. Invisible. The kind that grinds. She occupied a space that had no name. Too educated for the men who wanted decorative wives. Too poor for the men who wanted dowries. Too plain, by the standards of a society that measured women in silk and symmetry, for the men who wanted ornaments. And too proud, though she would not have called it pride, to pretend she was less than what she was in order to make someone comfortable enough to dance with her. And there was the other thing, the thing that polite people in Cambridge mentioned only by implication and impolite people mentioned by name. She was half Italian. In 1840s England, this was not a footnote. It was a sentence. The country was aggressively, proudly, reflexively suspicious of the foreign. Italian immigrants occupied a peculiar position in the English imagination, admired as artists, musicians, and scholars in the abstract, distrusted as Catholics, radicals, and charlatans in the specific. An Italian physician was tolerable if he stayed in his lane, treating the poor, dispensing remedies, remaining picturesque. An Italian physician's daughter, who had opinions about English agriculture and English soil, was something else entirely. She was an intrusion. Harriet had her father's olive complexion, her father's dark eyes, her father's surname. In the drawing rooms of Cambridgeshire, these were not assets, they were annotations. Every introduction carried an invisible footnote, foreign. Every conversation contained a moment, usually early, usually disguised as curiosity, when someone asked where her family was from, and the answer Padua landed in the room like a dropped plate. She learned to anticipate it. She learned to say, "My mother was English," in the same breath as, "My father is Dr. Marchetti," as though the English half could neutralize the Italian half, as though identity were a chemical equation that could be balanced. It could not. But the performance was expected, and Harriet, who had been performing normality in drawing rooms since she was 16, had perfected it. She was 27 when Sir Philip Fenwick walked into her father's shop. Philip Fenwick was 43, a baronet, and tired. He had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. He had come to Dr. Marchetti because the London physicians had failed him. Chest pains, recurring fevers, a persistent heaviness in his limbs that 3 separate doctors had attributed to 3 separate causes, none of which had responded to 3 separate courses of treatment. Now, a baronet in 1840s, England sat in the narrow, uncomfortable space between the landed gentry and the peerage, titled but not noble. Sir Philip had a house and a name and land in Northumberland, but he did not sit in the House of Lords. He did not command the wealth of a duke or the influence of an earl. What he had was an estate he did not fully understand, a daughter he was losing to grief, and a body that was failing him with the slow, indifferent cruelty of a machine running down. Lydia, his first wife, had died of a wasting illness 3 years earlier. The London physician had called it a decline of the constitution, which was the medical profession's way of saying they did not know what killed her. Philip suspected they had missed something obvious. This suspicion, that the obvious could be missed by men who were supposed to see it, is what brought him to an Italian apothecary in Cambridge, whom the respectable physicians distrusted. Marchetti examined him for 2 hours. He identified a cardiac irregularity, a weakness in the rhythm of the heart that the London doctors had mistaken for nervous exhaustion. He prescribed digitalis, carefully dosed. He prescribed rest. He prescribed a diet that Philip found punitive and effective. During the 6 weeks of treatment, Philip came to the shop 3 times a week, and during those visits he met Harriet. He did not fall in love with her beauty. He was not a man who noticed beauty easily. Lydia had been beautiful, golden-haired and blue-eyed, and everything the ballrooms wanted, and he had loved her for her laugh, not her face. What he noticed was this. On his 3rd visit, while waiting for Marchetti to prepare a tincture, Philip mentioned that the wheat crop on his Northumberland estate had failed for the 2nd consecutive year. His land agent blamed the weather. Philip was not certain the weather was the whole story. Harriet, who was measuring dried chamomile at the counter, said without looking up, "Is the failure concentrated in the lower fields near the river?" Philip blinked. "How did you know that?" "Because you said Northumberland, which means heavy clay soil, and if the lower fields are near water, the drainage will be poor. Poor drainage creates standing moisture. Standing moisture in clay soil with repeated wheat planting produces ideal conditions for rust." "For what?" "Wheat rust. A fungal disease. You will see it as orange-red pustules on the stems and leaves, usually worst after wet springs. It is not the weather, it is the soil. And if your land agent has been planting the same crop in the same rotation for more than 4 years, the fungus has established itself and will return every season until the cycle is broken." She did not look up from the chamomile. She said it plainly, directly, as a fact she had known so long it did not occur to her it was remarkable. Philip looked at this woman, chestnut-haired, olive-skinned, measuring chamomile with soil-roughened hands, and forgot what he had come to ask about. He came back the next day, and the day after. Not for the tincture, for the conversation. He proposed 6 weeks later. They were standing in the herb garden behind the shop, because Philip had learned that Harriet was most herself among plants. "I am making a mess of this," he said, which was the first honest thing, and then, "I cannot offer you romance. I don't think I have it in me." "Lydia." He stopped, started again. "I am not a young man. I have not been a well man. I am still. There is grief, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I have a house that is falling apart, and a daughter who is smarter than anyone in it, and a library with 400 volumes. He looked at her. "And a garden. It has gone to ruin. You would hate what has happened to the soil." Harriet almost smiled. "I am asking badly," he said. "You are asking honestly. That is better." Harriet looked at him. She was 27. Her father's health was declining. The practice would not survive another 5 years. She had no dowry, no prospects, and a mind that had been running out of room in the narrow house above the apothecary's shop for a decade. She said yes. Not because she loved him. She would grow to in the quiet, steady way that people grow to love someone who sees them clearly and does not look away. She said yes because he was the first person in her life who had heard her say something intelligent and responded by asking a follow-up question. The wedding was small. The journey north was long. And the arrival at Fenwick Hall was the beginning of something that Harriet would spend the next 4 years trying to name and never quite succeeding, because the English language has words for love and words for war, but very few words for the thing that happens when you walk into a house that has already decided who you are. Fenwick Hall stood on the edge of moorland near Hexham, Northumberland. Stone walls the colour of wet slate, a long gravel drive bordered by bare oaks, wind that came off the moors with a sound like something tearing, a sound that did not stop from October to April, and that Harriet would eventually learn to sleep through, not by finding peace, by running out of the energy to resist. The house was beautiful. Harriet would give it that. Beautiful the way a cenotaph is beautiful, built to honor something that was gone. Mrs. Drummond met them at the door. The housekeeper was 53, gray-haired, starched, efficient. She had run Fenwick Hall for 21 years. She had served Lydia for 11 of them. She curtsied to Harriet with the clipped mechanical movement of a woman fulfilling a duty she did not choose. "Welcome to Fenwick Hall, ma'am," she said. Ma'am. In a house where Lydia had been my lady for 11 years, the choice of address was a wall built from 2 syllables. "Thank you, Mrs. Drummond," Harriet said. "The house is lovely. Lady Fenwick was very particular about the—" "Arrangements," Mrs. Drummond replied. "We have maintained them exactly as she left them." Lady Fenwick. Present tense, as though Lydia had stepped out of the room and might return at any moment to find her arrangements disturbed. Charlotte did not come downstairs. A message was relayed through Mrs. Drummond. Miss Charlotte was indisposed. Miss Charlotte would join them for dinner. Miss Charlotte sent her regards. Charlotte was 12. She was not indisposed. She was upstairs, in the bedroom her mother had decorated for her, looking at a miniature portrait of Lydia that Lady Hartwell, Lydia's older sister, had given her with the instruction, "Keep this where you can see it, darling, so you never forget who your real mother was." The word "real" was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. It was carrying the weight of a campaign that had begun the day Philip announced his engagement, and would not end until every person in that house understood that Harriet was temporary. A Cheyenne placeholder, a woman who had been allowed into the building but not into the family. Harriet did not know any of this yet. She would learn it by walking into things. The first week taught her the architecture of resistance. Mrs. Drummond. Lady Fenwick preferred the morning room arranged with the writing desk by the east window. Harriet had moved nothing. She was being told that every arrangement was sacred, that the position of a desk was a monument. The cook, Mrs. Firth. "Lady Fenwick's menus are in the pantry file. We keep to her schedule." Harriet had not suggested changing the menus. She was being told that the food itself belonged to Lydia. Charlotte, at dinner on the 3rd evening, speaking to her father as though Harriet's chair were empty. "Papa, may I be excused? I have letters to write to Aunt Hartwell." Aunt Hartwell. Every mention of the name was a reminder that Charlotte's real family, her mother's family, existed outside this marriage, that the bonds that mattered ran through blood, not ceremony. Harriet noticed everything. She catalogued it with the same thoroughness she applied to soil composition and plant disease. She filed each observation without complaint, because complaining would confirm the household's suspicion that she was difficult, and being difficult was the one thing a stepmother could not afford to be. She found the herb garden behind the kitchen wing on her 4th day. It was neglected, overgrown, weedy. The beds collapsed. No one had tended it since Lydia died, because Lydia had not cared about herb gardens, and what Lydia did not care about, the household did not maintain. Harriet knelt in the cold October soil and began pulling weeds. No one told her she could. No one told her she couldn't. The herb garden existed in the margin of the estate's attention, too unimportant to defend, too small to argue over. She claimed it by being there every day until presence became fact. It was the only space in Fenwick. Hall, that was hers. 4 years. That is how long the marriage lasted. And in those 4 years, while the household treated her as a guest who had overstayed, Harriet built something no one would acknowledge until it was nearly too late. The estate's finances were failing. Harriet discovered this within a month of her arrival, when she asked to see the household accounts, and Mrs. Drummond, after a pause long enough to convey that the request was unusual, produced them. The numbers were wrong, not fraudulently, incompetently. The land agent, Mr. Greaves, was a man of good intentions and limited arithmetic. He had been adding up columns incorrectly for years, producing totals that looked plausible but bore no relationship to reality. The estate was spending more than it earned. Debts were accumulating. Tenant rents were miscalculated, some families paying too much, others too little. None of it aligned with the acreage or yield records. Harriet could not correct the ledgers, officially. She was the new wife. She had no authority over estate business. Philip was unwell and disinclined to scrutinize numbers that looked approximately right. Mr. Greaves would have been offended, and a land agent's offense, in a household already hostile to the new mistress, was a luxury Harriet could not afford. So she did it in secret. She copied the ledger books. Every night after the household was asleep, she sat in the small parlor with a single candle and worked through the figures. She identified errors. She recalculated rents. She cross-referenced yield records with tenant payments and found discrepancies going back 6 years. Then she guided Mr. Greaves toward the corrections, not by telling him, by asking. "Mr. Greaves, I noticed the wheat yield from the lower fields seemed lower than expected. Do you think the drainage might be affecting the crop?" And Mr. Greaves, who was not unintelligent, only uncareful, would investigate and discover the problem. And was the mechanism behind the clock face essential, invisible, and easily replaced in the eyes of anyone who only looked at the time? The blight was worse. Wheat rust had been spreading through the lower fields for 3 seasons, and Mr. Greaves's response, plant more wheat and hope for better weather, was the agricultural equivalent of treating a fever by wishing it away. Harriet knew what to do. She had known since the day she identified the problem from her father's shop. Copper sulfate solution. French vintners had been experimenting with copper compounds to protect grapevines from mildew. Her father subscribed to agricultural journals from the continent, and Harriet had read a preliminary report from a vineyard owner in Medoc who claimed that vines sprayed with a copper and lime preparation resisted fungal infection. No one in England had tried applying the principle to wheat. No one in England, as far as Harriet could determine, had considered that a treatment for French grapes might work on English grain. But the underlying chemistry was the same: copper ions disrupting fungal growth. The plant was irrelevant. The copper was the mechanism. She tested it first in her herb garden, small plots, controlled conditions. She recorded the results in the same journals she had kept since Cambridge: germination rates, soil acidity tests, fungal progression. When the test plots showed a 70% reduction in rust infection, she went to the head gardener. "Mr. Hayward, I have been experimenting with a copper sulfate preparation in the herb garden. The results suggest it could help the wheat fields. Would you be willing to try it on the lower east quarter?" Mr. Hayward looked at her. This physician's daughter, this stepmother, this woman with soil under her fingernails was saved. 6 tenant families kept their was saved. 6 tenant families kept their farms because a fungal disease was stopped by a woman who was not supposed to know about fungal diseases and who received no credit for stopping it. That harvest mattered beyond Fenwick Hall. The timing was not an accident. The 1840s in England were known, even by the people living through them, as the Hungry Forties. The Irish potato famine was ravaging the West, sending waves of starving refugees across the Irish Sea. The Corn Laws, tariffs that kept grain prices artificially high to benefit landowners, had been repealed in 1846 after years of bitter political warfare. But the repeal came too late for many. English agriculture was in crisis. Wheat prices were volatile. Tenant farmers who had survived on thin margins for generations were being pushed off their land. The workhouses were full. The streets of northern industrial cities were full. And in the countryside, the difference between a successful harvest and a failed one was the difference between a family staying on their land and that family joining the growing procession of the dispossessed. Harriet's copper sulfate treatment did not save England. It saved 43 people in Northumberland, but 43 people was the whole world if you were one of them. And in 1848, when the rest of the country was arguing about corn laws and Chartism and whether the poor deserved to eat, a woman in a herb garden was quietly making sure that 6 families did. No one wrote about it. No one reported it. No one gave a speech in Parliament about the physician's daughter in Northumberland who had adapted French grape science to English wheat and prevented a local catastrophe. The machinery of history does not record the work of women who operate in herb gardens, but the harvest was saved, and the families ate. And that was enough for Harriet, who had never expected credit and had therefore never been disappointed by its absence. Then Charlotte got scarlet fever. It was February, the worst month for illness in Northumberland, when the cold had been grinding on for so long that bodies ran out of resistance and the diseases that had been waiting since autumn walked in through the open door. The local physician, Dr. Hewitt, examined Charlotte and prescribed rest and prayer, which was the standard medical treatment for a disease that the medical profession did not yet fully understand. Harriet watched him leave and then went to work. Cool compresses, changed every 2 hours through the night, an infusion of elderflower and willow bark, her father's preparation, antipyretic, gentle enough for a child's system. Careful monitoring of the rash progression, recorded hourly in a notebook that Harriet kept beside Charlotte's bed for 19 consecutive days. Charlotte was delirious for the worst of it. Fever of 104. She called for her mother, not Harriet, Lydia, the dead woman, the golden-haired ghost who existed in a miniature portrait on the bedside table and in the carefully maintained architecture of a house that refused to let her go. Harriet held Charlotte's hand while the girl cried for a woman who could not come. She pressed cold cloths against the burning forehead. She counted breaths. She measured doses with the precision of a woman who understood that the difference between medicine and poison was arithmetic. Charlotte survived. When the fever broke on the 19th day, Harriet was sitting in the chair beside the bed where she had been sitting for most of the previous 3 weeks, and her own hands were shaking with exhaustion, and the first thought she had was, "I need to check the Eastfield drainage before the spring rain." Charlotte opened her eyes. She looked at Harriet. She did not recognize her, not because of the fever, but because Charlotte had never looked at Harriet closely enough to know what she looked like. Harriet was a presence in the house, not a person, a shape at the breakfast table, a voice that said, "Pass the salt." "Where is Aunt Hartwell?" Charlotte whispered. "She is in London, darling. She will visit next month." Charlotte closed her eyes. She did not say thank you. She did not ask who had been sitting with her for 19 days. She rolled toward the wall, toward the miniature portrait of Lydia, and went back to sleep. Harriet stood. She washed her hands. She went downstairs to check the household accounts. The days continued. Harriet rose at 6. She dressed. She ate breakfast alone or with Charlotte, who did not speak. She checked the herb garden. She reviewed whatever household papers she could access without drawing attention. She wrote letters to the journal. She mixed copper sulfate preparations when the season required it. She mended her own clothes because the household seamstress was assigned to Charlotte, and she did not want to ask for anything that could be refused. She read in the evenings by a single candle. She went to bed. She did this every day. She did it on the days when Charlotte spoke to her and on the days when Charlotte did not. She did it on the mornings after she had been crying and on the mornings after she had not. She did it because the estate required it, and because no one else was going to do it, and because Harriet had long ago discovered that purpose does not wait for you to feel ready. 6 months later, Lady Hartwell would tell Charlotte that Dr. Hewitt had saved her life. Charlotte would believe it. She would write a thank-you letter to Dr. Hewitt on cream stationery. She would not write a letter to Harriet because no one had told her there was anything to thank Harriet for. That is how erasure works, not with a single act, with 100 small omissions, each one so reasonable that no one notices the person disappearing. The letters began in Harriet's 2nd year at Fenwick Hall. Her intellectual lifeline, the thing that kept her mind from turning in on itself during the long Northumberland evenings when Charlotte would not speak to her, and Mrs. Drummond locked the pantry as though Harriet might steal the silverware. She had written to the Journal of the Royal Agricultural Society of England about her copper sulfate treatment anonymously, under the initials H.V. The V was for Voss, her mother's maiden name. Anne Voss, before she married Vincenzo Marchetti and became the English wife of an Italian physician. Harriet chose the initials deliberately. Marchetti was too identifiable, too foreign, too easy to dismiss. Fenwick was a name the household already resented her carrying. H.V. was a ghost, a pair of initials attached to ideas that had no body, no face, no sex. The paper was published. It generated correspondence. Other natural philosophers wrote to H.V. in care of the journal. Harriet wrote back. Small network of minds discussing soil chemistry, crop disease, drainage engineering, the practical science of keeping land alive. One correspondent stood out. The letters came from Yorkshire. They were rigorous, generous, thorough. The writer followed Harriet's logic, identified the weak passages, built on the strong ones. The writer understood both theory and practice, which was rare. Most scholars knew theory. Most farmers knew practice. This person knew both. The writer signed only with a title, Thornfield. Harriet assumed it was a land agent, or a gentleman farmer, or possibly a scholar at one of the northern universities who maintained a practical interest in agriculture. She did not investigate. The correspondence was the one part of her life where she was met as a mind, not a role, and she was not willing to risk it by introducing the complications of identity. She wrote to Thornfield about the blight pattern on the Fenwick estate's lower fields. She described the soil, composition, the drainage issues, the copper sulfate treatment. She cited Liebig. She disagreed with Liebig. She proposed an alternative theory of nitrogen fixation in clay-heavy soils that Thornfield called, in his next letter, the most original thinking I have encountered on this subject in a decade. No one had called Harriet's thinking original. No one had called it anything. Her thinking existed in the margins of ledger books and the pages of anonymous journals and the soil of a herb garden that no one visited. But Thornfield read her. Thornfield engaged. Thornfield pushed back when she was wrong and conceded when she was right and asked the questions that made her thinking sharper. On the nights when the house was dark, and Charlotte's rejection still rang in the silence, and the wind came off the moors like something grieving, Harriet sat in her small room and wrote to a stranger who did not know she was a woman, did not know she was a stepmother, did not know she was writing by the light of a single candle because the housekeeper had reduced her candle ration, and she felt for the length of a letter like a person who existed. Philip died on a Thursday. Heart seizure. Sudden. He had been well that morning. Or what passed for well in a man whose heart had been weakening for years. He ate breakfast. He read the Post. He sat in his study and looked out at the moors. He did not say what he was thinking. Harriet brought him tea at 11. He took her hand. A rare gesture. Philip was not a man who touched easily. He said, "This house would have fallen without you. I am sorry they don't see it." She squeezed his hand. She did not say it's all right, because it was not all right, and Philip was not a man who wanted to be lied to. He died at 3:30, in his chair, by the window, with his hand still resting on the arm where Harriet had placed the teacup. She found him when she came to collect it. His eyes were closed. His face was peaceful. His hand was still warm. She sat with him for 20 minutes. She did not cry. She had not yet earned the right to cry for Philip. That was how it felt, the strange, guilty arithmetic of stepmother grief. She had loved him. But she had loved him as a quiet, kind, imperfect man who saw her and did not look away, and that kind of love did not produce the operatic grief that the household expected from a widow. If she wept too much, they would call it performance. If she wept too little, they would call it proof that she had never loved him. She chose silence. She closed his eyes. She rang the bell for Mrs. Drummond, and then she went upstairs to her small room and pressed her hands flat against her thighs to stop them shaking. Philip was dead, and the single person in Fenwick Hall who had ever said her name with kindness was gone. Everything that followed was a siege. Lady Hartwell arrived for the funeral wearing lavender gray, half-mourning, not black. This was the work of sorrow that you are only the work of sorrow that you are only beginning. She was 45, fair-haired, still, plump, comfortable, prosperous-looking. She had a soft voice, a warm smile, and hands that reached for Charlotte the moment she stepped out of the carriage with the practiced certainty of a woman claiming something that belonged to her. "My darling girl," she said, folding Charlotte against her lavender bosom. "I am here now." She nodded to Harriet. A single nod, polite, brief, the kind of nod you give a servant who has opened the door, an acknowledgment of presence that simultaneously communicates insignificance. What happened next was legal, and it drove everything that came after. When a man died in 1849 England, his wife's future depended almost entirely on what he had written in his marriage, settlement and his will. A first wife, a wife whose family had wealth and connections, typically negotiated a generous jointure, a guaranteed annual income drawn from the estate that would support her for the rest of her life. A second wife, particularly a second wife with no family wealth and no powerful relatives, was often less protected. Under the law of coverture, which would not be reformed until the Married Women's Property Act of 1870, a married woman had almost no independent legal identity. She could not own property in her own name. She could not sign contracts. She could not sue or be sued. In the eyes of English law, a married woman was absorbed into her husband, the way a river is absorbed into the sea. She existed legally only through him. This meant that Lady Hartwell, who was married, whose husband Lord Hartwell was very much alive, could not serve as Charlotte's legal trustee. A married woman could not hold property in trust. The law did not permit it, but Lady Hartwell was not a woman who allowed the law to inconvenience her. Harriet's marriage settlement had been drawn up by Philip's solicitor, Mr. Talbot. Mr. Talbot was competent. He was also a close associate of Lady Hartwell, who had recommended him. The settlement gave Harriet a jointure of £50 per year. Enough to survive, not enough to live independently. The estate itself passed to Charlotte, held in trust until she reached 21. The trustee, the legal trustee, the man whose name appeared on the documents, was Mr. Talbot. But Mr. Talbot took his instructions from Lady Hartwell. This was not written in any legal document. It did not need to be. Lady Hartwell was Lydia's sister, Charlotte's aunt, the family's moral authority. When she told Mr. Talbot how the trust should be managed, he listened, because Lady Hartwell's social power was worth more than any legal authority. She could not sign the documents, but she decided what the documents said. The distinction was invisible to everyone except the people it harmed. £50 a year and a solicitor controlled by a hostile aunt. That was what Philip's death left Harriet. Philip had also, in the final months of his life, written a letter to Mr. Talbot expressing his wish that Harriet remain at Fenwick Hall as Charlotte's guardian. The letter was not legally binding. It was a request, and requests, in the hands of a solicitor who answered to a woman who wanted the requester gone, had the structural integrity of wet paper. Lady Hartwell did not move quickly. She was too intelligent for that. Quick moves looked aggressive, and Lady Hartwell never looked aggressive. She looked concerned. She looked responsible. She looked like a loving aunt doing her painful duty. The dismantling took 5 weeks. Week 1. Harriet's sitting room, the small parlor where she kept her ledger copies and her botanical journals, was needed for Charlotte's painting lessons. Charlotte did not paint. Charlotte had never expressed interest in painting. A painting instructor was hired from Newcastle and installed in the parlor with an easel and a set of watercolors and a cheerful mandate to occupy the room from 9 to 3 every day. Harriet moved her journals to her bedroom. Week 2. Her place at the head of the dining table was reassigned. Charlotte should sit at the head, Lady Hartwell said gently over breakfast, as though the thought had just occurred to her. She is the heir, after all, and it might help her feel a sense of continuity. Continuity. The word was a scalpel. It meant the house belongs to Lydia's daughter, and the head of the table belongs to the head of the house, and you are neither. Harriet moved to the side of the table. She did not argue. Arguing with Lady Hartwell was like arguing with fog. The substance dispersed, reformed, and settled back exactly where it had been, and you were left damp and exhausted, and no further forward. Week 3. Her be preserved, as he left it, for be preserved, as he left it, for Charlotte's comfort. Harriet was moved to the former governess's room at the end of the second-floor corridor, small, cold, a single window facing north, which in Northumberland meant facing directly into the wind. The fireplace worked, but was allocated only enough coal for an evening fire, not a morning one. Mrs. Drummond controlled the coal ration. Mrs. Drummond took her instructions from Lady Hartwell. Week 4. The household accounts were removed from Harriet's desk. Mr. Greaves was instructed to report directly to Lady Hartwell. The gardener, Mr. Hayward, was told, in Mrs. Drummond's careful phrasing, that the estate's agricultural decisions will be managed by the trustee's office now. Week 5. Lady Hartwell sat Harriet down in the morning room, Lydia's morning room with the desk by the east window, and said with a warmth that could have heated a cathedral, "My dear Harriet, you have been so brave, so strong, and you must be so very tired. I want you to know that you need not trouble yourself with household matters any longer. Mrs. Drummond and I will manage everything. You should rest, read, walk, take care of yourself. You have earned that." She said it as though she were giving Harriet a gift, and anyone listening, the vicar's wife having tea in the next room, Mrs. Drummond arranging flowers in the doorway, would have heard a kind woman offering relief to an exhausted widow. Harriet heard the lock turning. She had been removed from the dining table, the bedroom, the sitting room, the accounts, and the estate management. She had been compressed into a small room at the end of a cold corridor with a view of the moors and a coal ration controlled by a woman who believed she was a fortune hunter. And every step had been so gentle, so reasonable, so wrapped in concern, that if Harriet had complained to anyone, the vicar, the solicitor, the neighbors, they would have said, "But Lady Hartwell is being so kind to you. That is the most dangerous kind of cruelty, the kind that looks, from the outside, like love." Charlotte delivered the next blow at a dinner with the vicar of Hexham, Reverend Mayhew, and his wife. Lady Hartwell had arranged the evening. The table was set for 5, Lady Hartwell at the head, Charlotte beside her, the vicar and his wife across, and Harriet at the far end beside the sideboard. The conversation was pleasant. The food was good. Mrs. Firth still cooked Lydia's menus, which were, Harriet admitted privately, excellent. The vicar discussed his parish. His wife discussed the weather. Lady Hartwell discussed Charlotte's prospects. She was 16 now, nearly old enough for a season, a lovely girl with her mother's beauty and her father's gentleness. And then Charlotte, in a voice as clear and composed as a "have family matters to discuss." "Mrs. Voss, I wonder if you might be more comfortable dining in your room this evening. Aunt Hartwell and I have family matters to discuss." Mrs. Voss. Her maiden name. Charlotte had stripped the marriage, the estate, the family, the 4 years of invisible labor from Harriet in 2 syllables, and she had done it in front of a vicar. The vicar looked at his plate. His wife looked at Lady Hartwell. Lady Hartwell looked at Charlotte with an expression of mild surprise that was so perfectly performed it might have been rehearsed, and probably was. "Charlotte, darling," Lady Hartwell murmured, "that is, perhaps—" "It is fine," Harriet said. She stood. She picked up her plate. She picked up her glass. She walked out of the dining room, up the stairs, down the corridor, into the small, cold governess's room at the end of the hall. She set the plate on the writing desk. She sat in the hard wooden chair. She ate alone. The food was cold by the time she started. She ate it anyway. Waste was something she could not afford, financially or morally. When she finished, she set the plate outside the door for Polly to collect. Then she opened her journal and worked on the copper sulfate concentration ratios for the spring planting, because the blight would return if the fields were not treated. And no one else knew this, and the tenant's children would go hungry if the harvest failed. And the fact that the household had decided she did not exist did not change leaving. Of course she did. She had 50 leaving. Of course she did. She had £50 a year. She had a father's house in Cambridge. She could walk away from this place and these people and start again somewhere she was not hated. It was the sensible thing, the self-preserving thing, the thing that any reasonable person would advise. But Harriet knew something that reasonable people do not always consider. She knew what would happen to the estate if she left. The blight treatment needed to be reapplied every spring. Mr. Greaves did not know the formula. Mr. Hayward knew how to apply it, but not how to mix it. If Harriet left, the treatment would stop. The blight would return. The harvest would fail. 6 tenant families, 43 people, including 19 children whose names Harriet knew, would lose their farms. The accounts needed monitoring. Mr. Greaves was still making errors. Harriet was still correcting them in secret, leaving notes in the margins of documents she was not supposed to have access to, asking innocent questions that led to necessary adjustments. If she left, the errors would compound. Within 2 years, the estate would be insolvent. And Charlotte. Charlotte, who had said, "You will never be my mother and Mrs. Voss, and I wonder if you might be more comfortable dining in your room." Charlotte, who did not know that Harriet had held her hand through 19 nights of fever. Charlotte, who was 16 and angry and grieving and being shaped into a weapon by a woman who loved her but loved control more. If Harriet left, Charlotte would inherit an estate stripped of its competent management, burdened with debt, and controlled by a solicitor who took his orders from a woman whose own financial situation, as Harriet had quietly discovered, was deteriorating. Lady Hartwell's husband, Lord Hartwell, had lost money in railway speculation. The Hartwell estate was bleeding. Lady Hartwell needed the Fenwick Trust funds, not just for Charlotte, but for herself. Harriet stayed because leaving was the selfish thing. And Harriet, for all her virtues, had one terrible flaw. She was incapable of selfishness where children were involved, even children who hated her, especially those. Lady Hartwell's masterpiece arrived in the autumn. It was not a confrontation, it was a rumor. She began telling people, not directly, never directly, that Harriet had contributed to Philip's death. Not poison, nothing so crude, just questions, raised eyebrows, a concerned tone in the drawing rooms of Hexham and Newcastle and the country houses where the gentry gathered to exchange information the way merchants exchange currency. "A physician's daughter," Lady Hartwell would say with a delicate pause. "One would think she might have noticed the symptoms earlier. Poor Philip was so trusting." This accusation, the suggestion that a second wife hastened her husband's death, was not Lady Hartwell's invention. It was a weapon with a very long history. In the centuries before forensic medicine, before autopsies were routine, before anyone could prove with certainty what had killed a man in his own home, the accusation of spousal harm was devastatingly easy to make and nearly impossible to disprove. There was no blood test, there was no toxicology report, there was a dead man and a living wife and a gap. Between those two facts that suspicion could fill with whatever story it liked. And the suspicion fell disproportionately, overwhelmingly, on second wives. The logic, such as it was, ran like this. A first wife married for love. A second wife married for advantage. A first wife had the endorsement of family and society. A second wife, particularly one who married above her station, had the endorsement of no one. And if the husband died, well, who benefited? The widow, the woman who inherited, the woman who had come from nothing and now had something. The term historians use is the Black Widow narrative. It was applied to second wives and widows across centuries of English social history, from medieval courts to Victorian drawing rooms. It required no evidence. It required only the suggestion, a raised eyebrow, a murmured concern, a "one does wonder" delivered over tea, and the social machinery of reputation did the rest. Lady Hartwell did not need to accuse Harriet in a courtroom. She accused her in a drawing room. And in 1849, England, a drawing-room conviction was far more devastating than a legal one. A legal accusation could be fought. A social one could only be endured. She did not need to say more. The implication assembled itself in the minds of the listeners, piece by piece, because the conclusion had been decided in advance, and the evidence was being arranged to fit. A young woman marries an older man with a weak heart. She is a physician's daughter. She would know the symptoms. She would know the timeline. She would know, with clinical exactness, what neglect looked like and what active neglect could accomplish. Harriet learned about the rumor the way she learned about most of what Lady Hartwell did, through silences. The vicar stopped visiting. The doctor's wife, Mrs. Pemberton, sent a note declining a tea invitation. The words, "at this time," doing the work of a door closing. The local families who had already been cool became glacial. The butcher's wife, who had always been friendly, began leaving Harriet's orders with the kitchen maid instead of handing them to her personally. The accusation was unprovable. It was also undeniable. In 1849, there was no forensic science, no toxicology report, no way to prove that a heart seizure was natural. And once the suggestion had been planted, once the words "physician's daughter" had been connected with the words "she might have noticed," the human imagination did the rest. Harriet was now alone in a house that did not want her, in a county that suspected her, with a jointure that Mr. Talbot was contesting at Lady Hartwell's direction, and a reputation that was being dismantled by Lady Hartwell's whispers. She had the herb garden, she had her journals, she had her letters to Thornfield. And at night, in the cold governess's room, by the light of whatever candle she had managed to keep, she worked. She checked the estate accounts, because the spring planting was approaching and the drainage on the lower fields needed repair and the copper sulfate needed ordering. She wrote to Thornfield about soil nitrogen and crop rotation and the specific challenges of clay-heavy ground in northern England. She did not write to Thornfield about the loneliness. She did not write about the governess's room or the coal ration or the dining table she was no longer welcome at. She kept the letters clean, scientific, professional, the one space in her life where she was met as a mind and she would not contaminate it with need. But Thornfield noticed anyway. In her last 3 letters, H.V. had begun writing at unusual hours. The ink varied, suggesting different lighting conditions. The handwriting, usually steady, showed occasional tremors. The tone, usually steady, had developed a quality that Thornfield could not name but recognized. The particular clarity of a person who is thinking very hard about soil chemistry, because thinking about anything else is unbearable. He did not mention it. He wrote back about nitrogen. He engaged with her arguments. He sent her a copy of a German paper on fungal resistance that he thought she would find interesting. And he began, quietly, to investigate who H.V. was. Harriet did not know she was being investigated. She knew only what she had always known, that there is a particular kind of invisibility reserved for stepmothers, not the invisibility of being ignored, the invisibility of being seen, and having what is seen be wrong. Every kindness suspected, every effort compared, every mistake confirming what everyone already decided before she walked through the door. She was not allowed to grieve the life she had before. She was not allowed to struggle with the life she had now. She was expected to love a child who did not choose her, honor a woman she never met, and build a home inside a memorial to someone else's marriage. And she had done all of it. She had held it together for years, without complaint, without credit, without a single person saying the words, "Thank you," and the world still called her the wicked stepmother. Because the story was written before she arrived, and nobody had asked her what the real story was. Nobody, that is, until a duke arrived at Fenwick Hall on a cold December morning and asked to see the herb garden. Tobias Waring, the 5th Duke of Thornfield, was not what people expected a duke to be, and he had stopped apologizing for it somewhere around the age of 30. He was lean where dukes were supposed to be broad, medium height where dukes were supposed to tower. His hair was sandy brown, going gray at the temples in a way he had not noticed until his valet mentioned it, and he wore dark blue coats and charcoal waistcoats because black made him look, in his own assessment, like a moderately successful undertaker. He kept wire-rimmed reading glasses pushed up on his head more often than on his nose, and his fingers were permanently stained with ink. And when he entered a room, the room did not go silent. This was the problem. The room was supposed to go silent. He was a duke, He held 3 estates, a seat in the House of Lords, and an annual income of £35,000. When the Duke of Thornfield entered a room, people were supposed to notice. They noticed. They just were not afraid. And in the peerage of 1849, England, a duke who did not frighten people was a duke who was not taken seriously. Society called him the Cold Duke. This was inaccurate in a way that had calcified into truth through sheer repetition. The name had begun 6 years earlier when his wife Mary died. Mary had been 24. Childbirth. The baby, a boy, did not survive either. Tobias was at her bedside for 22 hours. He held her hand while the physicians worked. He held her hand after they stopped. He held her hand until it went cold, and then he held it for another hour because letting go was an act his body refused to perform. He grieved. He grieved with the total, consuming, annihilating force of a man who had loved completely and lost completely. But he grieved privately. He did not weep at the memorial service. He did not collapse at the funeral. He did not perform the expected rituals of aristocratic mourning, the public breakdowns, the dramatic retreats, the slow, visible recovery that society required in order to categorize grief as genuine. He went home, he closed the door, and for 3 months he did not leave Thornfield Park. Society interpreted this as coldness. A man who truly loved his wife would have shown it. A man who retreated behind closed doors and refused visitors was either hiding something or feeling nothing. The gossip settled into consensus. The Duke of Thornfield was a cold man who had neglected his wife, consumed by his peculiar scientific interests, and her death was the natural consequence of being married to someone who cared more about soil than about people. None of this was true, but truth, in the social economy of the English aristocracy, was worth considerably less than a good story, and the story of the Cold Duke was a very good story. Tobias stopped correcting it. Correcting required explaining. Explaining required revisiting the 22 hours at Mary's bedside, and that was a door he had bricked shut and would not reopen for any audience. He retreated into his work. Agricultural science, soil chemistry, crop disease, the precision of problems that yielded to sustained thought, unlike grief, which yielded to nothing and simply sat in the corner of every room like a piece of furniture you kept bumping into in the dark. He built a laboratory at Thornfield Park. He corresponded with botanists and chemists across Europe. He funded agricultural research. He sat in the House of Lords and gave speeches about wheat yields and drainage reform that his colleagues found admirable and soporific. He was useful, respected, and completely alone. Nearly 2 years before this story's present, a letter had arrived at Thornfield Park that changed the shape of his solitude. The letter was from a correspondent who signed only as H.V. It described a blight pattern on wheat in the north of England with a specificity Tobias had never encountered outside a university laboratory, not merely observation, analysis, soil composition readings, drainage assessments, a proposed remedy using copper sulfate compounds, an original adaptation of French viticultural experiments to English cereal crops, with concentration adjustments for local soil conditions and a citation from Liebig's agricultural chemistry that most estate managers would not have heard of, let alone read. Tobias wrote back immediately. He asked 6 questions. H.V. answered all 6, corrected the assumptions behind 2 of them, and proposed a 7th question that Tobias had not considered and that kept him awake until 3 in the morning, working through the implications. In the governess's room at Fenwick Hall, Harriet read his reply by the last inch of a tallow candle. She read it twice. She turned the paper over as though there might be more on the back. There was not. She smoothed the letter flat on the desk and for a long time she sat with her hand resting on it. Then she took out a fresh sheet, dipped her pen, and began her response. The candle guttered. She did not notice. The correspondence became the intellectual center of his life. Every month, a letter from H.V. arrived, and every month Tobias read it with a focus that excluded everything else. This person, whoever they were, thought the way he thought. Precisely, practically. Without the decorative rhetoric that most scientific correspondents use to signal erudition, H.V. wrote to be understood, not to be admired, and the difference was a revelation. He assumed the writer was a land agent, or a gentleman farmer with an unusually rigorous mind, possibly a physician, with agricultural interests. The medical references in H.V.'s letters suggested training in pharmacology. He did not consider that the writer might be a woman. This was not misogyny. It was statistics. In 1849 England, the number of women publishing agricultural science, even anonymously, was vanishingly small. The possibility simply did not occur to him. At Fenwick Hall, Harriet sealed her latest letter with hands still cold from the garden. She addressed it to the post office in Hexham, where she collected and sent all her correspondence on market days, between purchasing copper sulfate and checking the price of flour. No one in the household knew about the letters. No one in the household would have cared. He tried to discover H.V.'s identity. The letters were posted from Hexham, Northumberland. The journal that had originally published H.V.'s paper had no additional information. The submission had arrived by post, with no return address beyond a post office box. The most recent letter from H.V., received in November, mentioned Fenwick Hall by name. The writer described the blight on the Fenwick estate's lower fields in language that could only come from direct, sustained observation. Soil acidity readings taken over multiple seasons, drainage maps drawn from personal inspection, yield records spanning 3 years. H.V. was at Fenwick Hall, or closely connected to it. Then, in December, a separate letter arrived. This one was from Lady Hartwell. She identified herself as the guardian of Charlotte Fenwick, niece and ward, and explained that she was writing on behalf of Mr. Talbot, the estate's trustee, to request the Duke of Thornfield's counsel on agricultural matters. The estate's yields had declined. The finances were strained. She had heard of his expertise and wondered if he might visit. 2 letters, 2 paths to the same house. One from a woman who wanted his authority, one from a mind that had earned his respect. Tobias accepted the invitation. He told Lady Hartwell he would arrive in January to assess the estate. He did not tell her that he was coming, primarily, to find the person who had been writing him the most brilliant correspondence of his life. He arrived on a Tuesday in late January, when the moors were the color of iron, and the sky sat so low over Northumberland that the horizon seemed to have been erased. Lady Hartwell met him in the front hall. She was exactly as her letters had suggested, warm, composed, impeccably turned out in lavender wool. She smiled. She offered tea. She led him to the morning room, Lydia's morning room, with the desk by the east window, and gave him the version of events she had been perfecting since the funeral. The estate was struggling. The harvests had been poor. The previous baronet, dear Philip, so trusting, so easily influenced, had made unfortunate decisions in his final years, including the marriage to an apothecary's daughter who had, despite everyone's hopes, proved unequal to the demands of managing a gentleman's household. "She means well," Lady Hartwell said with a generosity that is more damaging than outright accusation. "She is not an unkind woman. But she was raised in a shop, and the skills of a shop are not the skills of an estate. We have been managing despite the complication." Charlotte was presented, pretty, composed, fair-haired. She curtsied beautifully. She answered his questions about her education with the practiced fluency of a girl who had been coached. She mentioned her Aunt Hartwell 11 times in 20 minutes. Mrs. Drummond confirmed the narrative. The household ran well. The staff were loyal. The new arrangements, since Sir Philip's death, had been an improvement. Tobias listened. He wrote nothing down. He drank his tea. He asked about the estate's agriculture, and the questions he asked were not the questions of a casual visitor. They were precise. They were informed. They were the kind of questions that gave a vague account of weather-related crop failures and optimistic projections for the spring planting. "And the copper sulfate treatment?" Tobias asked. The room went quiet. "The treatment applied to the lower fields 18 months ago," Tobias continued in the same mild tone. "It is in the yield records. The autumn 1848 harvest from the lower east quarter showed a 73% improvement over the previous year. Someone applied a copper sulfate fungicide, an original preparation, not a commercially available compound. It saved the crop." Mr. Greaves looked at his hands. "Who authorized it?" Tobias asked. No one answered, because answering would have meant naming Harriet, and naming Harriet would have contradicted the story that everyone in the room had agreed to tell. Tobias set down his teacup. "I would like to walk the grounds," he said, "if you will excuse me." He found the herb garden behind the kitchen wing. It was January, and most of the beds were dormant, but the structure was unmistakable. This was not a decorative garden. It was a working laboratory. Test plots marked with wooden stakes and labels in a neat, slanted hand, a stone basin with copper sulfate residue dried along the rim, a potting bench with measuring instruments, a soil thermometer, a glass hydrometer, a set of scales, a stack of journals, leather-bound, weather-worn, one left open on the bench as though someone had been interrupted mid-thought. And at the far end, kneeling in the cold soil beside a row of dormant rosemary, a woman. She had her back to him, chestnut hair pinned loosely, with threads of silver visible at the temples, not the silver of age, the silver of sustained stress, of years spent managing more than a body can comfortably hold. A sage-green dress, practical, stained at the knees from kneeling. Sturdy, build, hands in the earth. She had not been told he was visiting. No one had told her. She heard his footstep on the gravel path and turned. Dark amber eyes, direct. Startled but not flustered, the look of a woman who has been interrupted in the middle of a thought and is assessing whether the interruption is worth the cost of losing the thought. "Forgive me," Tobias said. "I was examining the garden, the copper sulfate preparation in the basin. Was this your work?" She stood. She brushed soil from her hands. She studied him, his lean frame, his ink-stained fingers, his reading glasses pushed up on his head, his dark blue coat, with the sharp, assessing attention of a woman who has learned to read people quickly because the consequences of misjudging are severe. She had no idea who he was. Lady Hartwell had not mentioned a visitor. Mrs. Drummond had not informed her. She assumed he was an agricultural assessor, perhaps, or a scholar visiting the North. "It was," she said, "a copper sulfate and lime preparation. I adapted it from French viticultural experiments on grape mildew. The principle is the same, but the concentration had to be adjusted for the soil acidity. I can show you the records if you are interested." She said it without performance, without apology, without the hedging qualifications that women in 1849 were expected to attach to any statement of technical knowledge. "I think perhaps," my late husband mentioned. She stated it flatly, plainly, because it was a fact she lived inside, not a fact she was performing. Something happened in Tobias's chest. He could not have named it. He did not try. "The soil acidity adjustments," he said carefully. "Did you test them using Liebig's framework, or did you develop an independent method?" She looked at him more closely. Most agricultural assessors did not cite Liebig. "Independent," she said. "Liebig's nitrogen calculations assume uniform soil composition, which is not realistic for moorland clay. The acidity variation across a single field can be significant. I tested each quadrant separately using litmus preparations and adjusted the copper sulfate concentration accordingly." "You tested the soil acidity of each quadrant?" "Quarterly, for 2 years, using litmus paper and vinegar reactions, my father's method for testing medicinal compounds, adapted for agricultural soil. The records are in the journal on the bench, if you would like to see them." Tobias looked at the journal on the bench. He looked at the woman standing in a herb garden in January with soil on her hands and silver in her hair, and the casual, devastating competence of someone who had been doing brilliant work in secret for so long she had forgotten it was supposed to be impossible. "You are H.V.," he said. She went very still. The wind came off the moors and pressed against them both, and for a moment the only sound was the wind and the silence of a woman whose secret identity had just been spoken aloud by a stranger in her garden. "I have been reading your letters for nearly 2 years," Tobias said. "I am Thornfield." Harriet looked at him, at the ink stains, at the reading glasses, at the face of a man who had been corresponding with her mind for the better part of a year without knowing her name or her face, or the fact that she wrote his favorite letters by candlelight in a room at the end of a cold corridor because the housekeeper had reduced her candle ration. "You are the Duke," she said. "I am. The Duke of Thornfield. 35,000 a year, 3 estates, published in the Edinburgh Review." "You read my paper in the Edinburgh Review?" "I disagreed with your conclusions about nitrogen fixation in sandstone substrates. I said so in my 3rd letter." "You did. You were right. I revised the paper." They stood in the herb garden. The wind blew. The stone walls of Fenwick Hall rose behind them, grey and indifferent, containing a household that had spent years trying to erase the woman standing in front of him. "They told me you were a complication," Tobias said quietly. "They would. They told me you were out of your depth, that you were a physician's daughter who married above her station and could not manage a gentleman's household." Harriet's expression did not change. She had heard all of this before. Hearing it repeated by a duke did not make it more true or more painful. It was simply the story. Her story, as told by everyone except her. "And what do you think?" she said. He looked at the garden, the meticulous test plots, the labeled stakes, the soil thermometer, the quarterly acidity measurements recorded in a journal that no one in the house knew existed. He looked at her hands, roughened, soil under the fingernails, the hands of a woman who did not direct work, but did it, who knelt in cold earth in January because the rosemary beds needed preparation and no one else would prepare them. "I think," he said, "that the person who wrote those letters is the most rigorous scientific mind I have corresponded with in 20 years. And I think that person has been standing in this garden the entire time, holding the estate together, while the household upstairs built a memorial to someone else and pretended you did not exist." Harriet looked at him for a long time. He had hazel eyes, warm, not cold. He wore blue, not black. His hands were stained with ink, not clean and commanding. He was nothing like the dukes in the stories Charlotte read, the tall, terrifying, gray-eyed men who swept into rooms and made them go silent. He was a man who read her letters and revised his papers when she was right. That was worth more than silence. "Would you like to see the full records?" she asked. "Very much." She reached past him for the journal on the bench. Their arms did not touch. The space between them was 6 inches, and years of loneliness and the quiet electric awareness of two people who have known each other's minds through letters and are only now meeting in the flesh. She handed him the journal. He opened it. He began to read, and for the first time since she had arrived at Fenwick Hall, Harriet stood beside another person in her garden and did not feel alone. He had spent 6 years being the man society decided he was, the cold duke, the negligent husband, the man who let his wife die while he studied plants. She had spent nearly 5 years being the woman the household decided she was, the scheming stepmother, the physician's daughter who married above her station, the complication. And when they stood in that herb garden, and he said her initials and she said his title, something passed between them that neither would have been able to name. Years later, if asked, Tobias would say it felt like setting down a weight he had forgotten he was carrying. Harriet would say nothing, because Harriet did not talk about such things. She would simply look at the herb garden and the person standing in it and allow the memory to speak for itself. Tobias returned to the house. He sat with Lady Hartwell for dinner. He was polite, he was careful. He did not reveal what he knew, but he asked for the estate ledgers, all of them. Lady Hartwell produced the official books, the ones Mr. Greaves maintained, the ones that told the story Lady Hartwell wanted told. Tobias read them at the desk in the guest room that night, by good candlelight, with a fire that the housekeeper had provided because he was a duke, and dukes received coal and candles that stepmothers did not. The official ledgers were adequate. The arithmetic was clumsy but functional. The management was mediocre, the kind of estate stewardship that prevented disaster without producing prosperity. But in the margins, in a different hand, in smaller script, in the slanted, careful writing he had been reading for nearly 2 years, were corrections. Dozens of them. Recalculated rents, adjusted yield projections, notes on drainage repairs, a schedule for copper sulfate application with concentration ratios calibrated to specific field quadrants, and notes about Charlotte. C's music tutor, £12, funded from reduced kitchen expenditure. C's winter coat, £4, funded from herb garden sales. C's Latin books, 2 shillings and 6pence, reallocated from linen budget. Every line was a gift Charlotte had never known she received. Every line was evidence of a love that had been delivered in secret, recorded in margins, and denied by every person in the house who was supposed to be paying attention. Harriet had not just kept the ledgers, she had kept the estate. She had kept the child. She had kept everything, and the cost of keeping it was the governess's room, and the cold corridor, and the coal ration, and the dining table she was no longer welcome at, and the name, Mrs. Voss, that her stepdaughter used to strip her of the only family she had left. Tobias closed. The ledger. He removed his glasses. He sat in the guest room with its good fire and its adequate candles, and thought about a woman 3 floors below him, in a small room, in the dark, who had been holding this house together with her bare hands, while the household built a monument to the woman who came before her. And he understood, not with his mind, which had understood for hours, but with the part of himself he had bricked shut 6 years ago, that he was going to do something about it. He spent 3 days at Fenwick Hall. He did not confront Lady Hartwell. He did not announce his findings. He investigated methodically, patiently, with the quiet thoroughness of a man who knows that data, properly assembled, is more devastating than any accusation. He walked the tenant farms. This required tact. The tenants were wary of a duke, any duke, asking questions about their landlord's estate. But Tobias had a gift for tenants. He spoke to them about crops, about drainage, about clay, soil and wet weather, and in the process of talking about things they understood, they began talking about things they were reluctant to say directly. Thomas Ridley, who farmed the lower east quarter, the fields the copper sulfate had saved, put it this way: "The lady came herself, brought the mixture, showed me how to apply it, stayed half a day to make sure the concentration was right." "Which lady?" Tobias asked. Ridley looked uncomfortable. The second one, Sir Philip's wife, not the first one." "Mrs. Fenwick?" "Aye." He paused. "We don't call her that. Mrs. Drummond said, 'Well, we call her the lady when we call her anything.'" "She saved your harvest?" "She saved more than that, Your Grace. My boy was sick in the spring, the fever that went through the village. She came with medicine, her own preparation, sat with him 2 nights. Wouldn't take payment. My wife tried to bring her eggs, after as thanks, and Mrs. Drummond turned her away at the kitchen door, said the lady was not receiving visitors." This was the pattern. At every farm Tobias visited, the same story assembled in different voices. The lady had helped. The lady had come with medicine, with soil advice, with calculations about fair rent when the land agent overcharged. The lady had taught the children arithmetic during the school term when the village teacher was ill. The lady had identified the drainage failure on the north field and drawn a map Tobias found pinned to the wall of one tenant's barn, annotated in the handwriting he knew. And at every farm, the same second chapter, the help had stopped. Not because the lady had stopped offering, because Lady Hartwell's people had made it clear that the tenants were not to accept assistance from the stepmother, because Mrs. Drummond had closed the kitchen door, because the social machinery of a rural English estate had been calibrated to ensure that Harriet's competence remained invisible even to the people who had benefited from it. Tobias returned to the house each evening and sat at dinner with Lady Hartwell and Charlotte and made pleasant conversation about nothing. He did not tip his hand. He did not let his face reveal what was building behind it. On the 3rd evening after dinner, he requested a private meeting with Lady Hartwell. They sat in the morning room. Lady Hartwell poured tea. She was composed. She had been composed throughout his visit, monitoring his movements with the alert, strategic attention of a woman who understood that a duke's opinion could determine everything. "I have examined the estate thoroughly," Tobias said. "I would like to share my assessment." "Of course, Your Grace. I appreciate your diligence." He opened the ledger. The official one, Mr. Greaves's version. He placed it on the table between them. "The estate's financial management is mediocre," he said. "Mr. Greaves is a competent man working beyond his abilities. The arithmetic is adequate. The strategy is not." Lady Hartwell nodded. This was expected. This was why she had invited him, to confirm what she already believed and to lend ducal authority to whatever changes she wanted to make. "However," Tobias said, and he opened the second ledger, the one with Harriet's corrections in the margins, and placed it beside the first. "The estate's financial recovery between 1847 and 1849 was not the result of Mr. Greaves's management." He pointed to the margin notes, the recalculated rents, the drainage repair schedule, the copper sulfate formula. "These corrections are in a different hand. They use an analytical method I have encountered in one other place, in letters sent to me over the past 2 years under the initials H. Lady Hartwell's hands remained steady on her teacup. Her face remained warm. But something behind her eyes shifted. A recalculation. The crop treatment that saved the 1848 harvest was not authorized by Mr. Greaves. It was developed, tested, and implemented by the person who wrote those margin notes. The same person who has been correcting the estate's accounts in secret for more than 4 years." He paused. He was not a dramatic man. He did not enjoy confrontation, but he understood, with the clarity of a scientist presenting evidence, that the next sentence would change the architecture of this house. "Your sister's husband married a woman who has been holding this estate together. The woman you have been removing from this household is the reason this household still exists." Lady Hartwell set down her tea. She did not crumble. She did not look away. She pivoted, not toward the evidence, but toward the interpretation. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was measured, concerned, warm. "I understand that Mrs. Voss is a clever woman. I have never denied that, but cleverness and integrity are not the same thing. A woman who corrects ledgers in secret, who conducts agricultural experiments without authorization, who corresponds anonymously with a duke, these are not the actions of a trustworthy person. These are the actions of a woman who has been building a case, positioning herself, creating a narrative in which she is indispensable, so that when the time comes, when a man of your standing arrives, she can present herself as the wronged heroine of a story she has been writing from the beginning." It was brilliant. It was the most dangerous thing Lady Hartwell had said, because it contained just enough truth to function. Harriet had worked in secret. Harriet had corresponded anonymously. Harriet had, without question, built a body of evidence that demonstrated her value. The question was whether that evidence was genuine competence or calculated performance. Tobias recognized the argument. It was the same argument that had been used against every competent woman he had ever encountered. The suggestion that visible ability in a woman was not a virtue, but a strategy. That doing good work was suspicious if the person doing it was female. "Lady Hartwell," he said, "the copper sulfate treatment saved 6 tenant families from losing their farms. That is not a narrative. That is 43 people who ate last winter because of a formula developed in a herb garden by a woman who was not authorized to develop it." He paused. "I am not interested in her motives. I am interested in the fact that without her, this estate would be insolvent, and the child in your care would be inheriting ruins." Lady Hartwell's composure held. It held the way a dam holds, completely until it doesn't. "She is not family," Lady Hartwell said, and for the first time the warmth dropped. The soft voice thinned. Beneath the lavender and the tea and the careful performance of maternal concern, there was something older and harder. "Lydia was my sister. Charlotte is my niece. This estate is Lydia's legacy, and I will not allow a physician's daughter from a shop in Cambridge to claim what my sister built." "Your sister did not build this estate, Lady Hartwell. Your sister lived in it. There is a difference." The silence that followed filled the room. Neither of them moved. Lady Hartwell stood. She smoothed her skirt. She picked up her teacup and carried it to the sideboard with the small, deliberate movements of a woman who is holding herself together by the discipline of small actions. "I will speak with my solicitor," she said. "You may speak with whomever you wish, but I will be recommending to the Chancery Court that the trusteeship be reviewed. The estate's financial health is the result of work performed by a person who has been excluded from its management. That is not a stable arrangement. It is a liability." Lady Hartwell left the room. Her footsteps were even. Her back was straight. Her hands, Tobias noticed as she reached for the door-handle, were trembling. He did not feel satisfaction. He felt tired. He poured himself more tea. He drank it alone. This is the scene. The one this story has been building toward since Charlotte said, "You will never be my mother" at a breakfast table in January. Tobias did not make a public speech. He did not humiliate Lady Hartwell at a dinner party. He did not stand in a ballroom and announce the truth to a gasping crowd. He did something quieter and more difficult. He gave Charlotte the evidence and asked her to think. He found her in the library the next morning. She was reading, or pretending to read, which is what 16-year-olds do in libraries when they are aware that something significant is happening in their house, and no one is telling them what it is. "Miss Fenwick," he said, "may I sit?" She nodded, wary. She had been told by Lady Hartwell that the Duke was assessing the estate. She had not been told what he had found. Tobias placed 2 ledger books on the table, the official version and the one with Harriet's corrections. "These are the estate accounts," he said. "The one on the left is the version your land agent maintains. The one on the right contains additional work. I would like you to read them both." "I don't understand estate accounts, Your Grace." "You understand arithmetic. Your stepmother taught you." Charlotte flinched at the word stepmother. A small flinch, the kind that has been practiced into smallness by repetition. "I am not going to tell you what to think," Tobias said. "I am going to give you the evidence and ask you to be the intelligent young woman I believe you are." He stood. He left the room. He closed the door behind him. Charlotte sat with the ledgers. She did not want to open them. She wanted to find Lady Hartwell and have the situation explained to her in words that were warm and certain, and did not require her to discover anything on her own. But the Duke had left her alone with the books, and Charlotte, for all her anger, for all her grief, for all the careful coaching that had shaped her into a weapon aimed at the woman who replaced her mother, Charlotte was, at her core, honest. She had been taught honesty by 2 people, her father, who valued it but could not always practice it, and Harriet, who practiced it so consistently that Charlotte had mistaken it for coldness. She opened the official ledger first. She followed the columns. The numbers were adequate. She could trace the income, the expenditures, the rents. Then she opened the second ledger, and she began to see. The corrections were everywhere. Not dramatic, small. A rent recalculated, a payment corrected, a total adjusted by £3 14 which did not sound like much until you understood that £3 14 compounded across 40 entries, was the difference between solvency and debt. She recognized the handwriting. She had seen it on the labels in the herb garden. She had seen it on the Latin exercises that appeared on her desk during the weeks when her tutor was ill, and someone, she had assumed Mrs. Drummond, had written practice sentences for her to conjugate. She found the notes about herself. C's music tutor, £12, funded from reduced kitchen expenditure. Charlotte stared at the entry. Her music tutor, the one who came every Thursday from Newcastle. She had assumed the money came from the estate's general funds, managed by Lady Hartwell. She had assumed many things about where things came from, because when you are 16 and someone provides for you, you do not typically investigate the source. C's winter coat, £4, funded from herb garden sales. The green coat, the one with the brass buttons that she had worn all last winter, bought from herb garden sales, from the garden behind the kitchen wing, from the garden that Harriet tended every morning in all weather, growing medicinal herbs and selling them to the apothecary in Hexham for pennies that she turned into brass buttons on a green coat. C's Latin books, 2 shillings and 6pence, reallocated from linen, budget. Harriet had reduced her own linen allowance to buy Charlotte Latin books. Charlotte felt this fact land in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread outward through years of meals eaten alone and rooms given up and names stripped away, and mornings at the breakfast table when a woman sat across from her and said nothing while Charlotte said, "You will never be my mother." She turned the page, and she found the scarlet fever entry. It was longer than the others, a full page of notes in Harriet's hand, medical observations recorded hourly, fever temperature, rash progression, dosage calculations for elderflower and willow bark infusions, day 3, fever 104 degrees, cool compress changed every 2 hours through the night. She called for her mother in her sleep. I held her hand. She will not remember. Charlotte stopped reading. She read it again. She called for her mother in her sleep. I held her hand. She will not remember. Charlotte remembered the Anne fever. She remembered fragments, heat, thirst, a cool cloth on her forehead, a hand holding hers in the dark. She had assumed the hand was Mrs. Drummond's. She had been told by Lady Hartwell, by Mrs. Drummond, by Dr. Hewitt in his thank-you letter, that the physician had saved her. She will not remember. Not a complaint, not a plea for recognition, a medical observation, recorded with the same precision as the fever temperature and the dosage calculations and the rash progression. Harriet had noted Charlotte's failure to remember her presence the way she noted soil acidity readings, as a data point, a fact of the environment, something to be recorded and worked around, not grieved over. Charlotte closed the ledger. She pressed her hands flat on the table. She was 16 years old, and for the first time the story she had been told about the woman who married her father was collapsing, and what was rising in its place was not a different story but a different world, a world in which the person she had been taught to reject was the person who had been keeping her alive. She sat for a long time. Then she picked up the ledger. She stood. She walked out of the library, down the corridor, through the kitchen passage, out the back door, and into the herb garden. Harriet was there. Of course she was there. She was always there. Kneeling in the cold January soil, tending a row of dormant rosemary because the rosemary would need to be healthy by spring, and no one else was going to tend it. Charlotte stood at the edge of the garden. She was holding the ledger. Tears were running down her face, and she did not wipe them, because wiping them would have required letting go of the book, and letting go of the book felt, in this moment, like letting go of the truth. Harriet looked up. She saw Charlotte. She saw the ledger. She saw the tears. Her hands went still in the soil. "You saved the estate," Charlotte said. Her voice was thin, high, the voice of a girl trying to hold something together that had already split. "I did what needed doing. You saved me. When I was sick. You were there you sat with me. Yes. 19 days. Yes. I called for my mother, and you—" She stopped. She looked at the ledger in her hands. She looked at Harriet. She tried again. "You held my hand. The whole time, and I didn't know. I wrote a thank-you letter to the doctor. I wrote to Dr. Hewitt, and I—" Her voice broke. She pressed the ledger against her chest like a shield, or maybe like something she was afraid of dropping. "I said you would never be my mother. I know. I was—" She shook her head. Tears were falling, and she did not wipe them. "That was the worst thing I ever said to anyone, and I said it to the person who, while I was sleeping, you were—" She could not finish the sentence. She was 16, and the distance between what she felt and what she could say was a gap that no amount of Latin or arithmetic had prepared her to cross. She stood in a cold garden holding the evidence of years of invisible love, and all her education had given her was the ability to recognize that she did not have the words for this. "I'm sorry," she said. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. "I'm sorry." Harriet stood, slowly, soil on her knees, soil on her hands, silver in her hair, amber eyes that had gone very bright. She opened her arms. Charlotte walked into them, and for the first time since Harriet had arrived at Fenwick Hall, the stepmother held the child who had rejected her, and the child held back. and neither of them said anything, because some reconciliations are too complete for language. They can only be held. The wind came off the moors. The rosemary beds were dormant. The stone walls of Fenwick Hall rose grey and indifferent behind them, and in the herb garden, in the margin, in the space that no one had ever thought important enough to contest, two footmen who had, until 3 days ago, taken his instructions from her. Charlotte stood beside Harriet in the front hall. She did not stand in front of Harriet. She did not stand behind. She stood beside, a deliberate physical choice that carried more meaning than any speech. "Aunt Hartwell," Charlotte said, "I would like you to visit at Christmas. You are my mother's sister, and I love you, but the household will be managed by Lady Fenwick, as it should have been from the beginning." Lady Fenwick? The married name. The name Charlotte had refused to use for 4 years, spoken now in front of Mrs. Drummond and the footman and the kitchen maid and the Duke, who stood quietly by the staircase, his hands in his pockets, watching the girl he had given a ledger to become the woman her stepmother had raised her to be. Lady Auntie Hartwell looked at Charlotte, at Lydia's face, the same fair hair, the same blue eyes, attached to a posture and a voice that were not Lydia's at all. That were, though Lady Hartwell would not have admitted it, Harriet's, the straight back, the level gaze, the measured, deliberate speech of a person who has learned to say exactly what she means because she has watched someone do it every day for 4 years. Something in Lady Hartwell's face shifted. What Harriet saw there was not what she expected. It was grief. The old grief, the real one. The loss of Lydia, who had been her sister and her closest friend, and the person she had spent years trying to preserve by refusing to let the house change. She had not been protecting Charlotte from Harriet. She had been protecting Lydia from being replaced, and she had failed, not because Harriet had won, but because you cannot fight a living woman with a dead one. The living woman is always there in the morning, holding a teacup, tending the garden, holding the child's hand through the fever. And the dead woman, no matter how beloved, is not. "Christmas," Lady Hartwell said. Her voice was not warm, it was not cold. It was the voice of a woman who has run out of performance and is left with only the bare, undecorated fact of herself. She kissed Charlotte's forehead. She nodded to Harriet. A different nod than the one she had given at the funeral. Not dismissive, not warm, but level, horizontal. The nod of one woman acknowledging another without yet knowing what the acknowledgment would grow into. She left. The carriage pulled away down the long gravel drive. The bare oaks watched it go. Harriet arrived. She was tired. That was all. The arrived. She was tired. That was all. The deep structural tiredness of a woman who has been carrying a house on her back for years and has only just been told she is allowed to set it down. Mrs. Drummond appeared beside her. "My lady," she said, the first time she had used those words, 2 syllables that unlocked a door that had been closed for 4 years. "Shall I prepare tea?" Harriet looked at Mrs. Drummond. This gray-haired, starched, efficient woman who had locked the pantry and reduced the candle ration and closed the kitchen door to a tenant's wife carrying eggs. She saw not a villain, but a soldier who had been following the wrong orders and was now, carefully, tentatively, saluting a new commanding officer. "Tea would be lovely, Mrs. Drummond." "Thank you." Mrs. Drummond turned, hesitated, turned back. "The coal ration for the east corridor," she said. "I will have it increased." "Thank you." "And the morning room, the desk by the east window." A pause. "It is yours, if you want it." Harriet nodded. She did not say anything else. Some surrenders are fragile. You accept them quietly. You let them exist without requiring them to explain themselves. Tobias found her in the herb garden that evening. The sun was low, what passed for sun in January in Northumberland, a pale smear above the moor line that turned the stone walls amber for 20 minutes before disappearing. He sat beside her on the bench. The journal, her journal, the one he had read in the guest room, the one that contained 2 years of soil measurements and copper sulfate calculations, and the scarlet fever notes that had broken Charlotte open, lay between them. They sat in silence for a while, two people who had spent nearly 2 years exchanging ideas on paper and were now learning what it felt like to occupy the same physical space. "I am going to recommend that the trusteeship be transferred to an independent solicitor," Tobias said. "Someone with no connection to Lady Hartwell. Charlotte's inheritance will be protected, and you will be consulted on estate management decisions." "Thank you. You should publish under your own name. The copper sulfate work is original. The soil chemistry is rigorous. The Royal Agricultural Society should see it. I have no credentials. You have results. Results are credentials." Harriet turned the journal over in her hands. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the garden, the dormant beds, the bare rosemary, the stone basin with its copper sulfate residue, the small, unglamorous kingdom she had built in the margin of someone else's estate. "Why did you come here?" she asked. "The real reason. To find H.V. And you found a stepmother in a herb garden." "I found the most interesting person I have met in 10 years. That she happened to be a stepmother in a herb garden is—" He paused, chose his words. "Is the part I did not expect but should have. The most important work in England is being done by people nobody is watching." Harriet looked at him, at the hazel eyes, the ink-stained fingers, the reading glasses pushed up on his head. At a man who was nothing like the dukes in the stories and everything like the correspondent she had been writing to for nearly 2 years, rigorous, generous, methodical, kind. "You were also misjudged," she said, "profoundly. They called you the Cold Duke. They did. You held your wife's hand for 22 hours while she died. I did, and you never corrected the story. Correcting it required reliving it. I was not willing to pay that price. I understand that." She said it simply. She did. They were both people who had chosen silence over self-defense, and they both knew what that silence had cost. "I am going to say something," Tobias said, "and I want you to know that I am saying it as myself, not as a duke. The title is— It is a coat. I am asking you to ignore the coat. I have been ignoring coats for 31 years. He almost smiled. "I have spent 6 years being the man who lost his wife and retreated into soil chemistry, because soil chemistry does not break your heart. And then, nearly 2 years ago, a letter arrived, and the person who wrote it thought the way I think and argued the way I wish I could argue and corrected me when I was wrong, with a clarity that made me revise not just my paper, but my assumption that I was going to spend the rest of my life alone." He turned to face her. "I would very much like to be the person who sees you, the actual you, Harriet, who is tired and angry and has soil under her fingernails and silver in her hair at 31, and who held a child's hand for 19 nights and wrote she will not remember as though it were a weather report." Harriet looked at him. The amber in her eyes caught the last of the January light. "You want me?" she said. Not a question. A test. The test of a woman who has learned to verify before she trusts. "I want you. Soil and silver and all." "Soil and silver and all." She said yes, quietly, in a garden, between two people who were too tired for performance and too honest for going to keep arguing with you about nitrogen fixation. "I am counting on it." And they sat on the bench in the herb garden, in the last light, in the cold, in the wind that came off the moors like something grieving and something beginning, and they did not kiss. Not yet. That would come later, in a different garden, on a different evening, when the rosemary was in bloom, and the air smelled like the thing Harriet had been building in the margins for years. For now they sat, two people who had found each other through letters, through soil, through the slow and patient work of being brilliant in a world that was not paying attention. And the silence between them was not empty. It was full. Full the way a field is full after the harvest has been gathered, cleared and resting and ready for what comes next. 6 months later. Thornfield Park, Yorkshire. Harriet Waring, Duchess of Thornfield, sat at her desk in the shared study and finished the final draft of her paper on copper sulfate blight treatment in clay-heavy soils. The paper was 28 pages long. It contained 2 years of field data, 17 soil acidity measurements, an original formula for copper-lime fungicide adapted from French viticultural principles to English wheat, and a conclusion that directly contradicted the prevailing academic consensus on nitrogen fixation. She signed it, Harriet Waring. Tobias, at the desk across from hers, looked up from his own correspondence. Finished? Finished. The Royal Agricultural Society will not know what to do with you. They will publish it, and then they will argue with me, and then they will discover that I am right, and they will be annoyed about it for approximately 1 year before citing me in their own papers. That is exactly what will happen. He paused. You are magnificent. I know. He laughed. She almost laughed. Almost. Harriet was still learning to laugh without checking first whether she was allowed to. The study at Thornfield Park had 2 desks, facing each other. Tobias's was covered in soil samples and German agricultural journals and a half-eaten sandwich he had forgotten about 3 hours ago. Harriet's was covered in ledger copies and botanical drawings, and a letter from Charlotte that had arrived that morning and that she had read 4 times already without telling Tobias, because some happinesses are private. They argued about Liebig at breakfast and soil drainage at dinner and the optimal concentration of copper sulfate for sandstone substrates during the carriage ride to the village, and it was, for both of them, the first time in years that home had felt like a place where they were allowed to be entirely, unapologetically themselves. Charlotte's letter was addressed to Mama H., a name she had invented because the existing words did not fit the shape of what Harriet had become to her, and Charlotte, who had inherited Harriet's stubbornness along with her Latin, refused to use a word that was not accurate, had gone in on schedule. The copper had gone in on schedule. The copper sulfate treatment had been applied to the lower fields, using the formula Harriet had developed, supervised by Mr. Hayward, who now kept a copy of Harriet's journal in his cottage and consulted it the way other men consulted the Bible. Charlotte had been teaching the youngest tenant children arithmetic, using Harriet's methods. She mentioned this casually in the middle of a paragraph about the weather, as though it were not the most important sentence in the letter. She had enclosed a pressed flower from the herb garden. Rosemary, the first bloom of the season. Harriet held the letter for a long time. She touched the pressed flower. She did not cry. Harriet was not a woman who cried easily. But she sat at her desk with the letter in her hands and the rosemary between her fingers, and the study full of soil samples and German journals and the remains of Tobias's sandwich, and she felt something she had not felt since the morning she knelt in the herb garden at Fenwick Hall and pulled the first weed from the first bed. Home, home. The thing you build in the margins when no one is watching. The thing that grows from soil and patience and the stubborn, daily decision to stay where you are not wanted until wanting is no longer the point. Tobias looked up. "Are you all right?" "She is tending the garden." He understood what that meant. He nodded. He went back to his correspondence. She went back to hers. The study was quiet. The afternoon light fell across both desks equally. 2 years later, Fenwick Hall. A woman walked through the herb garden with a child on her hip. The child was a boy, 18 months old, dark-haired, with hazel eyes that he had inherited from his father, and a grip on his mother's collar that suggested he had inherited her determination. His name was Philip, spelled differently from the man he was named after, because Harriet had wanted the honor without the replication. A new version, a new beginning with the old name carried forward. Charlotte was there, 18 now, tall, fair-haired like her mother, but with a directness in her gaze that was not Lydia's. She was planting a new row of rosemary in the bed that Harriet had started 4 years ago, and she was doing it with the steady, practiced movements of a person who has been taught by someone who takes soil seriously. She looked up when Harriet approached. She smiled. Not the practiced, coached smile of the girl who had been presented to a duke 3 years ago. A real smile. The kind that begins in recognition and ends in something that does not need to be named because it is already understood. "The acidity in the east bed is rising," Charlotte said. "I think the drainage is pulling acid from the peat. Add calcium hydroxide, a light application. Too much will shock the rosemary." "I know. You told me. Twice. I will tell you again if you over-apply." "I know that too." They worked in the garden. The boy grabbed a fistful of rosemary and attempted to eat it. Harriet removed it from his grip with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been removing inappropriate objects from a toddler's mouth for 18 months and would continue to do so for approximately 4 more years. Mrs. Drummond brought tea. She had changed, not all at once, not with a dramatic reversal, but with the slow, gradual shift of a person whose loyalty has been redirected by evidence. She called Harriet "Your Grace" when visitors were present, and "My Lady" when they were not, and, on rare occasions, when the kitchen was empty and the day had been long, "Harriet." That last was the real measure, not the title, the name. "There is a package arrived from London, Your Grace," Mrs. Drummond said. "No note. From Lady Hartwell." Charlotte and Harriet exchanged a look. Charlotte went to the front hall. She returned carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside, a set of botanical illustration books. Expensive, beautifully printed. The kind of books you buy for someone whose work you have decided to respect, even if you cannot bring yourself to say so. Charlotte placed them on the shelf in the morning room, beside the desk by the east window. Harriet's desk, she did not mention them. Some changes are too fragile to be named. You hold them gently. You place them on a shelf. And you let them exist without requiring them to explain themselves. And that is the story of the stepmother who stayed. She stayed because she chose to, every morning, for years. A duke did arrive, and what he did was not rescue, but recognition, which is a different thing and a harder. Her story before she walked through the door, and she chose every single morning to tend the garden anyway, to correct the ledgers, to mix the copper sulfate, to hold the hand of a girl who would not remember. Because doing what was right had never required an audience. Harriet Marchetti, Voss, Fenwick Waring, physician's daughter, stepmother, botanist, duchess, had always understood something that the people around her did not. That staying is not weakness. Staying when every rational voice tells you to leave, when the house does not want you and the child does not want you, and the coal ration has been halved and your name has been taken away. Staying under those conditions is the hardest thing a person can do, and the people who do it are not the villains of the story. They are the reason the story has a home, Can I tell you something? The word stepmother has carried the weight of villain for centuries, in fairy tales, in novels, in the whispered judgments of drawing rooms and school hallways and family dinners where someone sets down a plate and walks upstairs and eats alone. But the real stepmothers, the ones who show up every day for children who did not choose them, who build homes inside memorials, who love without the guarantee of being loved back, who hold hands in the dark and write she will not remember and go back to the garden in the morning, they are not villains. They are the bravest women in any room they enter, and they deserve a story that says so. If this touched your heart, if you are a stepmother or you love one, or you have been the Charlotte who did not see what was right in front of her, I want to hear from you. Drop your city, your country, the time where you are. Whether you listened in bed or on a drive or in a kitchen where the dishes are done and the house is finally quiet, you were not alone tonight. We were all here together. Share this with someone who needs it. Subscribe if you have not already. Another tale awaits. And remember, it is never too late to see the person who has been holding everything together. Sometimes all it takes is reading the ledger.